A former mentor, philosophical mentor of mine who is an analytic philosopher once told me that I should never begin a paper with an apology after doing so to an analytic audience. So in the interest of mediation, I will begin with an apology, but do so in the form of assertions. This paper is general and sweeping. It deals with a concept that is often seen to be philosophically taboo, that is unity. And this paper is relatively short, or it should be, if I don't stray from my reading practice. Its one possible merit is that it attempts to think the possibility of metaphysics after the domination of, I guess for lack of a better term, scientism, which tries to basically reduce metaphysics to physics or probability in some sense, and also a lot of post-structural thought that's been critical of metaphysics in the last several decades. Having said that, I try to read the concept of unity through Ricœur and MacIntyre, and they don't discuss it discreetly, so it's going to be quite a reconstruction, as it were. What is often referred to as the synoptic view is a philosophical conception of human existence in relation to a regulative principle or final cause. This principle, whatever it may be, is redeeming in the sense that should human existence be lived in accordance with it, the toil and trouble of our life would not be in vain. In Plato and Aristotle, the synoptic view is one which aligns life to a metaphysical principle of the good, which is superadded, as it were, to the basic level of necessity and biological metabolism. Until the 20th century, it seemed essential for a philosopher to offer some synoptic vision, whether this involved the summum bonum, the best of all possible worlds, the reconciliation of spirit and matter, or just simply a right relation to material itself. However, since the 20th century, what has dominated is a reluctance to commit or even consider such synoptics. On the one hand, European philosophy, with its roots in existential thought, tends to distrust systematic reductions of individual life. On the other hand, since its origin, Anglo-American philosophy, or analytic philosophy, has been preoccupied more with criticism of the sufficiency of concepts and presuppositions, which, as R.G. Collingwood puts it, has, quote, little by little destroyed everything in the way of positive doctrine that philosophy had ever possessed, end quote. And Collingwood, for those of you who are not familiar with him, is writing at the time of the emergence of analytic philosophy with G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell. I begin with this characterization of our historical situation in order to highlight how Paul Ricœur and Alasdair MacIntyre stand out against such philosophical tendencies. Both express a commitment to understanding human existence in relation to the metaphysical principle of unity. That is, this individual and fragmented life can be understood and lived in relation to a meaningful whole. Both therefore understand unity in quite a substantive sense, and given their religious affiliations and commitments, this would seem no surprise. As early as their Bampton lectures on the religion and atheism, 1966, significant differences can be detected with regard to the respective conceptions of unity, that is, what ontologically and metaphysically consists in unity, and how we should attempt to live ethically in accord with it. It may be that these differences can be explained more superficially in terms of MacIntyre's Catholicism and Ricœur's Reformed Protestantism. But I think these kinds of explanations, no matter how historically accurate, miss a very important point. Neither philosopher is reducible to their religious convictions. Rather, both hold philosophical views they find plausible and compelling for philosophical reasons, even if other reasons may be involved. So first I'll look at MacIntyre, then I'll turn to Ricœur, and then in conclusion, I'm going to focus on the role of convictions in Ricœur as a way of bringing MacIntyre and Ricœur a bit together, not to say that they're saying the same thing, but to show them in terms of some kind of complement or dialectic. For MacIntyre, unity is a cosmological feature which endows everything occurring within the cosmos its distinction. Though not using the term unity, he does in fact describe the universe according to a pre-existing order. In his essay, Truth is a Good, circa 1998, one of his key arguments with reference to a theory of truth in language is that truthful assertions are good not simply because they provide an accurate account of how things are. That is, true beliefs about a certain state of affairs. More importantly, argues MacIntyre, The good of truthful assertions enables one to think how things are in terms of why things are. In other words, the goal of inquiry is not simply to settle on a truthful account of how things are, but to reach a terminus of understanding. This terminus is neither a conglomeration of truthful accounts, nor is it a goal simply because truthful assertions are utile or instrumental or useful for human existence. The why of inquiry strives towards achieving an understanding of, quote, the place of the objects about which the mind judges in the overall order of things, end quote. Indeed, MacIntyre's appeal to the overall order of things is substantive and should be taken in a strong sense of there being a complete and final coherence to reality that the mind ever ceaselessly attempts to reach. Quote, it is then a metaphysical presupposition of this view of truth that there is an order of things, and this order exists independently of the human mind, just as do the objects and sets of objects that find their place within it, end quote. The cosmological implications of this metaphysical presupposition are perhaps most evident in MacIntyre's sympathetic portrayal of the ancient Greek conception of cosmic order and justice, in whose Justice, Which Rationality, 1988, he comments, quote, for the use of the word dike, or the root of the word justice in ancient Greek, presupposed that the universe had a single fundamental order, an order structuring both nature and society. To be dikaios, or fitting, is to conduct one's action and affairs in accordance with this order, end quote. The metaphysical notion of order to which MacIntyre is philosophically committed involves an already established coherency with which the human mind seeks conformity, or what is the rational form of inquiry to which he often alludes, or the process of rational inquiry. Consider, for example, his comment from an essay circa 1998 on first principles. Quote, genuinely first principles, so I shall argue, can have a place only within a universe characterized in terms of certain determinate, fixed, and unalterable ends. Ends which provide a standard by reference to which our individual purposes, desires, interests, and decisions can be evaluated as well or badly directed, end quote. MacIntyre is, of course, very much aware of the historical efforts of humankind to attempt to achieve this conformity and the ways in which such attempts can go terribly wrong, both philosophically and politically. He is, in one sense, by no means a champion of a monological notion of reason. His critics allege that he is too historical or even relativistic in the way he relies on narrative understanding and challenges strong theories of impartiality. Nonetheless, if MacIntyre has an aversion to overly simple notions of objectivity and truth, it is difficult to see how he does not, at some fundamental level, believe that rational inquiry should be measured by the eternal standards of order, whatever they may be, which constitute the universe as it is, independent of the human mind. To illustrate this problem, I want to consider next the epistemological and ethical implications of MacIntyre's commitment to order. Epistemologically, MacIntyre sees theories of truth and justification as inevitably bound to a substantive notion of truth. Truth cannot finally be some particular to a specific period of history or specific group of people. In an essay on moral relativism, MacIntyre asks, what is it to attain truth? He answers, quote, the perfected understanding in which inquiry terminates, when some mind is finally adequate to the subject matter about which it has been inquiring, consists in key part being able to say how things are, rather than how they seem to be from the particular, partial, and limited standpoint of some particular set of perceivers. Progress in inquiry consists in transcending the limitations of such particular and partial standpoints in a movement towards truth. And where there is no possibility of thus transcending such limitations, there is no application for the notion of truth. Successful inquiry terminates then in truth, end quote. One can see this burden of truth employed against rival versions of moral inquiry, particularly in relation to the genealogy of Foucault. MacIntyre argues in his 1990 book on encyclopedic and genealogical discourses that appeals to dislocations and maskings are compelling only because they rely upon standards external to the respective periods of history under investigation. Quote, in narrating the systematic development and recurrent workings of Foucault's strategies, it is not just that we have to ascribe a unity of project to a deliberating, purposeful self with its own unity as agent, if that project is to be intelligible. We have also to recognize the parts played by logic, by the identification, for example, of contradiction, by appeals to evidence, by practical reasoning. The standards in the light of which such reevaluations are made and such reasoning conducted are independent of the particular stages and moments of the temporary strategies through which the genealogist moves his or her overall projects forward. Hence, once again, it seems to be the case that the intelligibility of genealogy requires beliefs and allegiances of a kind precluded by the genealogical stance, end quote. Epistemologically, then, the human mind as rational has no choice but to be involved in a commitment to the kind of rational inquiry guided by a substantial notion of truth. We as rational beings are condemned to think under such a terminus and inevitably have no alibi for our refusal to do so. For those for whom this position on truth seems quite severe, I fear it is only worsened when one considers its ethical implications. This is because such a strong commitment to truth resolves into the argument that there cannot be competing truths, since in the end the final terminus is one truth. And we may regard as distinct or even singular domains of reality and human existence, and what we may regard as distinct or even singular domains of reality and human existence are inadequate ways of conceiving forms of inquiry. In his more recent God, Philosophy, Universities, 2009, MacIntyre argues that distinct domains of inquiry, quote, are not self-enclosed, so that truths in any one domain have no implications for what is true or false in any of the others, end quote. So on this view, it's not enough for someone to say that this is scientific truth, this is religious truth, this is philosophical truth. MacIntyre is arguing there's one truth, and therefore these disciplines must somehow come into alignment with another in agreement on the one truth. However, this seemingly totalistic and totalizing representation of inquiry, while no doubt diminishing the relative viewpoints of different peoples, also entails a demand that existing traditions and institutions submit their own precepts, practices, and beliefs to the test of historically developing knowledge. MacIntyre's conception of debate is forward-driven, in the sense that he sees any claims to universality, whether they be moral claims or individual assertion of rights, presuppose a kind of test of universalization. Yet rather than the criteria for this test already being known in advance, MacIntyre concedes that from our current historical standpoint, we work our way towards the universal terminus by engaging with what appears historically as the most compelling reasons. Indeed, MacIntyre's conception of rival traditions requires historical transformation through the philosophical and moral imagination. The progression towards truth, whilst not a final declaration that eliminates or marginalizes historical predecessors, is an ongoing self-reflection from within a particular tradition. MacIntyre, of course, retrieves historical sources to articulate what is problematic about modernity, and this articulation provides, in view of his conceptions of truth and order, the resources by which we can progress beyond philosophical parochialism. It would seem, nonetheless, that MacIntyre's forward-driven philosophical outlook would sit uneasily with Paul Ricœur. And perhaps this unease is represented in Ricœur's critiques of MacIntyre's account of narrative understanding and how it admits discussion of those types of particularities that problematize the notion of a narrative unity of life. And as you probably know, there are three that he mentions, and oneself as another. The difference between fictional author/narrator and the one who authors and narrates one's life. The distinct categorical difference between fiction and life with respect to beginnings and endings. And finally, the entanglement of other life histories and narratives in real life. Nonetheless, one can see a similarity between MacIntyre and Ricœur when considering Ricœur's 1955 essay on the wish and endeavor for unity. Ricœur states, quote, "The unity of the world and the unity of man are too near and yet too distant. Near as horizon, which is never reached, distant as a figure seen through an infrangible pane of glass, end quote. The view of unity as a horizon is perhaps indicative of the kind of terminus to which MacIntyre alludes. Moreover, the unbreakable glass separating us from reaching this terminus can, on MacIntyre's view, be understood as the historical process continually unfolding new modes of engagement and debate. There is also another respect which joins MacIntyre to Ricœur at this stage in his career. And this is the way Ricœur sees the order inherent to the universe as the prerequisite for human understanding. Ricœur thus sees the unity of the world correlative to the unity of humankind. This jointure between the external coherence of the universe and the particular coherence of human beings within the universe cannot be underestimated. As we saw with MacIntyre, it provides the metaphysical context in which truth extends beyond the private soul contemplating its internal reality. With respect to Ricœur, this jointure provides the foundation upon which the effort and desire to be can be developed in the sphere of justice, that is, the coexistence with others in the institutions we develop. Yet despite these similarities, there is no mistaking Ricœur's unwavering intention to make fragility a productive component of philosophy. In the same essay, he comments, quote, "We are incapable of coinciding with the flux of existence which lays the ground for all attitudes. First, this unique experience, which is my unique life, is never reflected in its lived simplicity. It is immediately perceived through the diverse cultural realizations which divide it. Man's unity is too primordial to be understood. But above all, cultural life is torn by the rivaling passions which have created it, and to which religion adds its own: theological rage, Pharisaic bad faith, ecclesiastical intolerance." End quote. The problem of human fragility is perhaps most clearly articulated in its ethical context 35 years later, when Ricœur discusses the ability of the self to relate to others. The shattered cogito, fragmented by the passions, as well as its own lack of certainty. Sorry, I inflected that wrong. It was a clause. The shattered cogito, fragmented by the passions, as well as its own lack of certainty. The question for Ricœur is not how to overcome uncertainty, that is, how to find a necessary and sufficient foundation or process of reasoning. Rather, it is how to understand the passions and fallible reason positively and productively. In the time remaining, I want to discuss this positive aspect in relation to how Ricœur understands the role of convictions in reason debate. In doing so, I assume Ricœur's argument that the order of the universe is correlative to the order of humankind, in this case, the order of ethics and justice. So what I'm trying to do here is show Ricœur as a complement to MacIntyre in the sense that MacIntyre talks about this process of rational inquiry and its terminus in one truth. And while I'm not saying Ricœur agrees with that, he's in the same vicinity or ballpark, as it were. And one way of showing how Ricœur's philosophy of fragility complements that is in terms of the significance he gives to convictions, which analytic philosophy simply will not entertain, at least not that I'm aware of, at least not in terms of theories of impartiality. So what I have to say in the final section about convictions is part of a larger conversation I have with Ricœur and Amartya Sen on theories of impartiality and the idea of justice. For Ricœur, convictions can be understood as those beliefs formed in part by passions and reasons, but above all constituted by one's ethical and symbolic orders. Whilst many philosophers, especially in the Anglo-American tradition, are hostile to convictions, Ricœur is not. We may have convictions and we may be convinced, but we do not necessarily understand these convictions. And this lack of understanding provides precisely the lacuna in which Ricœur will stake his philosophical claim. Before moving to Ricœur, let me initiate this transition by providing a link to MacIntyre. I think MacIntyre's commitment to truth and reasoned debate is complemented by Ricœur's philosophy, for in highlighting convictions, Ricœur's theory adds discreetly an understanding of what drives most debates and does not allow convictions to be marginalized or reduced to a form of irrationality. Ricœur develops his account of convictions according to an epistemological distinction he finds not only more realistic in view of everyday conflicts, but productive when understood in a broader framework. Ricœur insists that convictions express a form of commitment to values and meanings whose normative content has authority for a particular group or tradition, yet remains to be worked out and justified practically, that is, according to emergent situations of conflict. Convictions, as he will say, are therefore considered convictions. At least he says so about Rawls. Indeed, for Ricœur, there is no epistemological foundation for convictions, if what is meant by foundation is a self-secured and certain beginning. Convictions are, in the end, are not reducible to reasons, or, as Amartya Sen would say, reasonable reasons. Convictions are ethical beliefs that arise from within the context of an already existing ethical order or system of values. As he qualifies, convictions are not beliefs that, but beliefs in. Exactly that to which the in refers involves already existing values one has inherited through history and tradition. So in this respect, one has a belief in one's capacity to make decisions by virtue of an existing order of ethical values. As convicted, I am convinced a decision made is good according to the context of my ethical values. Convictions are truly normative in the sense that they are possible only because an ethical order provides a totality of signification in which one can distinguish between good and bad actions. Indeed, Ricœur refers discreetly to a notion of order, and it's different from MacIntyre's notion of order, but nonetheless, he refers to. Ricœur refers to order as that which precedes each of us and is often recognizable as a tradition of practices and shared understanding. Quote, the term order conceals the greatest difficulty for ethico-juridical philosophy, namely the status of the authority attached to this order, that which even makes it an order, end quote. We recognize ethical orders according to the way in which we recognize what has authority over our decision-making. Thus, to reason one's way to a judgment about a choice requires the values given by and accepted on authority in order to delineate a good choice from a bad one. Ricœur's fundamental point is to show that within the ethical domain, our reasons for acting in one way and not another are not reasons in the fully coet form of being justified. Rather, they are convictions that arise from within an ethical order, which we are then brought to justify in situations of conflict. In other words, convictions act as criteria for what an agent believes to be the basis for a prudent choice. These criteria are not identical to justifications. In situations of moral conflict, rational agents make decisions concerning how to act as if they were anticipating requirement of justification. Criteria can then be employed in the task of justifying an action should the agent be held accountable by someone else, an institution, or even the agent, him or herself. The criteria provided by an ethical order enable an agent to believe or to be convicted that what he or she is doing is good, right, or prudent. Nonetheless, a critic of Ricœur might argue that the relation of convictions to justification is viciously circular, epistemologically and ideologically. If we do not appeal to anything beyond convictions, whatever we argue will simply presuppose those convictions. Ricœur's counter is that any circularity between convictions and justification entails a process of critical revision, wherein the demand for justification becomes a way of revising one's convictions from within his or her ethical order. Similar to MacIntyre's notion of internal revision of a tradition through rival conflict, Ricœur emphasizes that any revision is not one in which another order imposes itself. Rather, external pressure allows for a refiguration of existing beliefs and values. Furthermore, Ricœur grants that this process of argumentation articulates universal claims, with the caveat that no justification can ever completely secure a claim's universality. So while no moral conviction can have any force if it did not make a claim to universality, for Ricœur, a conviction is an alleged or inchoative universal seeking recognition. The process of seeking recognition is a process of validation through argumentation whose conclusion attests to a universal principle of some kind that itself is subject to further validation according to new situations that arise, or what is a process of verification through one's life. Ricœur thus sees the paradigmatic model of argument and validation as being the juridical procedures of legal interpretation which hold in view a law in relation to a specific context. Because ethical reasoning is often faced with conflicts in specific situations, it forces the reasoning of groups to reassess their own assumptions and customs. There is, of course, no guarantee that this self-critical scrutiny will emerge. And it is true that Ricœur places a great deal of trust in an individual's capacity to admit another according to a hospitality. But convictions are themselves never certain forms of knowing. They should be understood to involve a mode of communication which does not stake itself upon a claim to finality. Ricœur therefore speaks of this component of his theory of justice as an act of confidence in our capacity to admit the other person into debate, without which claims to social cooperation and flourishing would be empty or an act of bad faith. In closing, I would like to consider a comparison with respect to the burden of reasoned debate. MacIntyre insists on a point of consistency by virtue of any appeal to the notion of truth. To make a truth claim is at the same time to submit oneself to a test of validation that is historically played out. Ricœur, whilst generally acknowledging the role of truth in debate, also reserves a place for conviction. And here it can be said that the wish for unity and truth is not so much a rational decision of submitting one's maxim to the test of universalization, as much it is motivated by conviction and passion to recognize the validity of another's rival's claim because one recognizes the validity of this rival's existence. But to admit this then puts metaphysics and its principle of unity in a precarious position. For we prioritize in some way the role of ethical orders as enabling our capacity to admit the other. If metaphysics, as the science of pure being, or being qua being, can no longer be considered the philosophy of first principles, it is perhaps because there is no consideration of pure being without its understanding through the correlate of this human life. Thank you.
Mais je voudrais poser une question sur... je peux parler français ou
Okay, I may need help. So.
Now my question just concerns this ontological status of ethical order in Ricœur, which is controversial for me. It's not so
right.
clear. So.
That's a good question, because I largely am thinking of ethical orders in terms of the imagination and how I'm thinking in particular of, I think it's in the Symbolism of Evil, Ricœur says that the sacred is something that human beings read onto the world. And so there's this notion that the symbolic and ethical order, because I see the symbolic and ethical order as the same thing, whether or not that's sufficient in the end, I don't know. But I see that as already an act of interpretation. It's to see the world as something that is sacred and ethical or symbolic in some sense. So if I were to talk about an ontology in relation to that kind of reading of order, it would be a very weak ontology. And it would be very, I guess in the end, very provisional because it is interpretive. So.
Thank you.
Maureen?
Anyway, I think this was very original and also very precise, but I would just like to ask two questions. One is, I think conviction, I've always read it as being kind of the intersection of the principle and singularity. So how one makes kind of the universalization principle one's own. So there is, if you want, it's not irrational at all. It is, if you want, grounded, it's embedded, it's appropriated. So there is, if you want, a step beyond the principle. It has to be put into the situation. I'm not sure whether one can compare MacIntyre and Ricœur immediately. I think one has to go to a shared point of antagonism, and that would be Kant. And I think you can't, if you want, ignore that how MacIntyre rubbishes Kant, saying basically duty leads to concentration camps, things like that.
Right.
The humanistic version of the categorical imperative, just really reading him in a very ungenerous way and in a very misleading way. And Ricœur defending Kant against Hegel the whole time, because Hegel kind of loses sight of the victims, because Hegel looks back on history, doesn't have, if you want, a forward view to kind of a system that enables freedom. So that's my other point.
Okay.
I think you have to take that into account, but I found so many of what you said. The point of argumentation where he says Habermas has to be the counterpart to Rawls here with his considered convictions. I found them all very right, only you do have to take into account these major differences between them in relation to Kant.
Yeah, so very good questions as usual from Maureen. If I characterize convictions as irrational, I'm sorry, I misled you. Certainly within my engagement with the March of Sen and most analytic philosophies of impartiality, they want to consider convictions as either irrational or just not quite rational in some sense. And so their way out to a strong theory of impartiality is to rely upon some kind of process that reaches a level of reasoning. So in a certain sense, they'll say, right, convictions are just the untutored human mind, and we need to talk about what it means to be a rational agent. So, but what I want, I think I'm in agreement with you, but so if I, on the first point at least, so if I didn't argue in agreement with you, then it's some kind of mistranslation when I wrote this paper out. But I want to consider convictions, because I agree with Ricœur in saying that convictions basically attest to some kind of universality. That is the reasoning that's provided by one's ethical symbolic order. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an ethical moral claim involved. Nobody wants to make an ethical moral claim and just say, yeah, my claim's not universal, but this is right, or something. So even analytic philosophers acknowledge that these conflicts within the arena of distributive justice and morality arise because each group or party in the debate thinks they have a universal status. These claims have a universal status. So I want to acknowledge that, but why I parrot, I place it in the position I do within a larger process of reasoned or rational argument is to say that there is a bit of reasoning in it, but because we are given or inherit these convictions from within an ethical order, they're not fully thought out, and they can't be fully thought out because we're not historically omniscient, and contingency is going to arise. So in a way, this kind of, for me, and whether or not this is a right move, I don't know, this relates to Ricœur's stronger argument about tragic wisdom, because tragic wisdom is that which you can't address the tragedy in any way, and so that's the limit for it. That's what we always have to bear in mind as the outside, as it were. As far as relation to the second point, it's funny because the debate between analytic and continental philosophy, a lot of historians of philosophy want to go back to Kant to try and show some kind of shared ground. I don't really have a response to your point. I accept it. I'm not denying it. It's just I don't think I'm very well versed with MacIntyre's dismissal of Kant, but I can certainly see it, and certainly in recent talks, he's less open to addressing such claims. He'll simply just reiterate things like, on my reading of the history of philosophy, Plato asked the right question. This is verbatim. Plato asked the right questions, Aristotle provided good answers, and Aquinas provided better ones. And he won't argue the position, that's it. And then, thanks for the points.
Well, mine is the question just to add on to that. Someone once told me that MacIntyre best books is the book on Marcuse.
Oh, right.
She did a Fontana Manners and asked about Marcuse. So MacIntyre did have another life, that was just an add-on. It wasn't
Thanks.
a paper, yes.
Thanks.
I have just a query. I appreciated your talk, and there's one thing you said about turbulence. The turbulence is, but when we on a train, on a ride, we go by one turbulence, one after the other. Where is the last?
Yeah.
Where do we go to? Where?
That's a good question because I wouldn't apply. I mean, I tried to draw a bridge between MacIntyre and Ricœur, saying, well, perhaps with Ricœur's notion of horizon, we can speak terminus, and that was, I wouldn't really commit too strongly to that. But certainly with MacIntyre, terminus is there. It's strong in the sense of one truth. So you can view that metaphysically and epistemologically. Now, teleologically, because he defends teleology, it's a bit tricky because his notion of teleology is in some sense not a determined end. So it's not as if we're going to arrive there or that end is, in fact, destined to happen in some strong historical sense. I think he means it in terms of a final cause of what draws us forward into inquiry. Now, whether we reach that, I think MacIntyre is actually pretty pessimistic about that. So he talks very positively about what philosophy should do, but
So it's on the way, it's always on the way.
it's always on the way. So that's the bit of history and relativism that's interesting for MacIntyre, and that qualifies his teleological notions. It sort of weakens him in some way because he's not talking about some kind of Hegelian endpoint. But it is difficult. But he is pessimistic because his ideal, unless it's changed, is the fishing community, which is this, the communitarianism between fishermen that share certain practices, understanding, and virtues, and that's where you can have the kind of shared inquiry that goes on. But.
Okay, well, thanks, Todd, again.
Thanks.